Europe's most celebrated royal bloodlines may hide their strangest secret in plain sight. Not who was added to the family tree, but who seems to have been erased from it. At first glance, the records look flawless. Kings marry queens, queens produce heirs, and every branch appears to connect cleanly to the next. But once those marriages are traced backward, the pattern changes. Entire lines become thinner, less documented, and strangely easy to lose. That is where the first suspicion begins, not with one error, but with a system of omissions that repeats across dynasties. The official story gives us order and continuity, yet certain royal women appear almost fully documented only after they become politically useful. When the trail turns to their mothers and grandmothers, the paper becomes lighter, the citations fewer, and the certainty suddenly weaker. That weakness is hard to dismiss. In a world obsessed with blood purity, why were the least verified brides welcomed so easily into the highest houses? The answer may be buried in the origin they were never meant to examine too closely. Some bloodlines look hidden precisely because they were already known. Look at the Romanovs. The official line points back to Rurik, a clean succession stretching through centuries, as if nothing ever broke. But the deeper you study the transition points, the more they resemble managed handoffs than natural inheritances. The paperwork is there, yet the bloodline feels obscured. That is where a few academic notes become important. Buried in the margins are references to Tar origins, mentioned and then quickly moved past. And that word matters. In older historical circles, Tar is never just a label, it echoes something wider, older, and far more uncomfortable to name. Across the Channel, Britain tells a similar story. In 1714, Hanover arrived from German lands as if the line had been prepared in advance. The explanation is formal and tidy. Protestant succession, parliamentary approval, a distant Stuart connection. Yet even that story depends on earlier house changes already underway. Several of those German principalities had already experienced fresh dynastic substitutions only a generation or two earlier. New names, new arms, new legitimacy. It begins to feel staged, not random, as if the throne itself was being prepared by changing the names around it before anyone noticed. Then the evidence shifts from bloodlines to buildings. Once I started looking at the palaces, the pattern stopped feeling genealogical and started feeling architectural. St. Petersburg, Vienna, London, Madrid. Different crowns, different architects, yet the same proportions keep returning with unsettling consistency. This is no longer a matter of style. It suggests a transferred technical language, one that appears in stone wherever power was being reorganized. The timeline matters too. Most of these structures rose or were heavily rebuilt in the early and middle 1700s, exactly when Tartary began disappearing from maps. And the maps themselves tell a larger story. Across French, Dutch, and British cartography, a vast landmass repeatedly appears under one name, Tartary. These were not idle guesses. They were trade maps, military maps, working documents used by merchants and officers who needed the terrain to be real. Some even mark cities, roads, and palace centers inside that region. That suggests an organized system, not a blank wilderness waiting for history to discover it, so the question sharpens. If Tartary was only a vague name for unknown interior lands, why did those same maps draw its structures so carefully? Because once you notice the missing branches, the altered maps, and the shared palace language, the royal trees stop looking complete. They start looking edited. The deeper I looked into royal lineages, the more the missing branches seem deliberate. In Europe's oldest dynasties, absence itself started to look like evidence. What makes the Tartarian question so unsettling is not just what was written, but what was quietly renamed. Once a civilization loses its name, its heirs can be rewritten too. In old imperial records, the line between bloodline and territory is thinner than it appears. A dynasty could inherit a land, then inherit its story, then hide the first inheritance entirely. That is why the royal houses of the 17th and 18th centuries matter so much. They appear as pristine families, yet they rise during the exact era Tartaria begins disappearing from maps. Take the marriages that linked courts from Vienna to St. Petersburg. The paperwork says alliance, but the repetition of the same elite circles suggests a far narrower pool than official history admits. Many of those brides came from smaller German courts, and that detail matters. Tiny principalities suddenly supplied Europe with queens, as if they were being positioned long before the crowns arrived. If those houses were truly obsessed with purity, why accept brides whose ancestry became murky just 2 generations back? That contradiction is where the official story starts to slip. The Romanovs are especially revealing. Their origin story is polished into an unbroken imperial line, yet the transition points around them feel managed rather than naturally inherited. Officially, the house links back to older Rus lines, but the farther you move from the headline names, the more the paper trail becomes selective, as if certain ancestors were never meant to be followed. Then the whispers begin, tar connections, buried in academic footnotes and quickly passed over. The term appears like a warning label, because it opens a door most historians prefer not to touch. That is why the Tartary name matters. It was not just a legend. It was a real cartographic label for a vast eastern world that European elites still had to account for. Some maps even place cities, roads, and palace-like centers inside Tartary. So what looked like an empty frontier may have been a structured landscape with real institutions, and that creates a problem for the standard story. If an imperial center vanished, where are the records of conquest, evacuation, or collapse? If nothing was hidden, what explains the silence? But Tartary leaves almost no such trail. Instead, the maps simply harden into new borders, and the old centers are absorbed into newer imperial names, as if they had always belonged there. Then comes the architecture, which behaves like another archive. Across empires, the great palaces follow nearly identical proportions, as if the same design language had been exported with the bloodlines. Look at the Winter Palace, Schönbrunn, and the restored royal complexes of Spain. Their facades do not just resemble one another, they seem designed by a shared mathematical hand. That same pattern appears in court emblems and ceremonial symbols. The double-headed eagle, for example, moves across Byzantium, the Habsburg world, Russia, and several Balkan courts like a remembered inheritance. Officially, those symbols are treated as independent traditions. Yet when the same sign keeps resurfacing beside the same families, it begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a badge. Language adds another layer. Court families were often ruled by translators in public, but their private correspondence suggests a hidden common idiom, one that formal history rarely names directly. And when archives begin to burn, the pattern turns ominous. Important royal records vanished in fires, exactly when lineages, properties, or territorial claims were about to be tested. Those fires did one useful thing. They made reconstruction easy. Once the old papers were gone, a new dynasty could be written into place without the burden of contradiction. Nowhere is this stranger than Siberia. Early maps show it as part of Tartary, yet by the 18th century it is absorbed so rapidly into Russia that the transition feels narratively compressed. Russian sources themselves describe arriving to find cities, stone structures, and organized settlement networks. That detail matters because it means the land was not empty, only unaccounted for. So the question is no longer whether the record contains gaps. The question is who benefited when those gaps became permanent, and why so many royal trees began at the moment Tartaria ended. If you want to understand why those royal trees were edited, you have to follow the old names, the burned records, and the buildings that still refuse to fit the official timeline. Once the old Tartarian name disappeared, the next move was to seal the paper trail. In royal archives, a missing ledger could be more useful than a forged one. That is why burned records matter so much. When a succession line became inconvenient, fire did not merely destroy evidence, it created a cleaner story for the next generation. In Venice, in Vienna, and St. Petersburg, clerks copied noble names into polished books, but the earliest generations were often vague. The closer you looked, the more the first pages dissolved. Those gaps were not random. They clustered around women brought into dynasties from smaller courts, as if the bloodline became visible only after the marriage contract was signed. Official genealogies praised purity, yet they repeatedly accepted brides whose maternal lines were thinly documented. That contradiction suggests selection, not accident, guided what was preserved. Then there are the so-called provincial houses. They appear modest on paper, but many suddenly rise into prominence exactly when old imperial lines need a fresh connection. Some dynasties were introduced as if they had always belonged there, a name would appear, a marriage would follow, and suddenly an entire court pretended the line had ancient roots. That pattern becomes more unsettling when you compare courts across Europe. The same diplomatic marriages often linked houses that had just survived reorganization, war, or sudden disappearance. The real break comes when you follow the maternal names, because fathers are loudly recorded, while mothers often vanish into abbreviations, initials, or convenient titles with no origin attached. That silence is important, because maternal lines carry hidden continuity. If you want to edit a bloodline without leaving obvious scars, you erase the women first. And the more you search, the more you find foreign names translated, shortened, or folded into local versions. That makes the line look native, even when the origin was something else entirely. That same method appears in court titles too. Grand Duchess, Princess, Consort, Regent. Labels were flexible enough to preserve hierarchy while masking who truly introduced the line. Look at the old Union treaties. They sound political, but they are also biological contracts, moving ancestry across borders while making the transfer look like ordinary diplomacy. Now add the maps. When a region is renamed, its ruling families are usually renamed with it. The geography changes first on paper and only later in the public mind. That is why Tartarian references mattered so much. They were not just labels on empty land. They marked a huge administrative world before it was broken into cleaner, imperial partitions. Some early encyclopedias even described Tartary as immense and organized, yet later writers reduced it to vague wilderness. That reversal is exactly what edited memory looks like. The same collapse happened to place names. Cities were absorbed, provinces were renamed, and older identities were folded into newer empires until the original administrative logic became untraceable. Now remember the architecture. Public buildings do not just shelter power, they announce continuity. When a regime inherits a palace, it inherits a visual claim to the past. That is why palaces built in the same century matter. They are not isolated monuments. They are synchronized declarations that some older authority already knew the language of grandeur. If the royal bloodlines were being reorganized, then the palace network would have needed to be reorganized too. Family, stone and seal were three parts of the same restoration. And then comes the question nobody wants to answer cleanly. Why do so many royal trees become easier to trace exactly when the oldest, most important branch should be hardest to see? Because the hardest truth to hide is not a missing cousin. It is a shared origin hidden behind separate flags, separate archives, and separate national myths. When you place the documents beside the maps and the palaces, the pattern stops looking accidental. It starts looking like a managed inheritance, passed forward under new names. That is the real danger of the Tartarian question. If the old order was bigger than the official record admits, then every edited family tree becomes a political artifact, not a neutral chart. And once you see that, the old names, the burned ledgers, and the palaces all take on a new weight. They are not leftovers. They are the surviving evidence of a hidden inheritance. And that is where the paper trail becomes dangerous. Because once you move from names to inheritances, you begin to see who benefited from every disappearance. In royal houses, inheritance was never only about land. It decided which bloodline could claim archives, titles, and the right to rewrite an entire lineage. That is why marriage contracts mattered so much. They did not merely unite families, they sealed alliances that could bury awkward origins for generations. When a noble bride arrived with a thin lineage, the real question was never her beauty. It was whether she carried a hidden branch powerful enough to matter. That is where the Tartarian question sharpens. Some genealogies suddenly become meaningful only after they enter a royal house, as if their earlier history had been delayed on purpose. The deeper you go, the more those missing branches resemble, not accidents but edits. Whole sections vanish just when they should connect one dynasty to another. And when the records fail, coats of arms start speaking. Certain symbols travel farther than bloodlines should, repeating across courts that claim to be unrelated. The double-headed eagle is the clearest example. It appears in imperial rooms from Vienna to Moscow, not as decoration but as a sign of shared authority. Once you compare those emblems, a pattern emerges. The same imperial language appears in places that were supposedly separate, as if one tradition split into many banners. Then come the courts that absorb new dynasties almost overnight. The record says succession. The architecture of power suggests something far more prepared. That preparation becomes visible in the palaces themselves. They rise with the same proportions, as if built from an inherited template rather than local invention. A palace is not just a residence. It is a manifesto in stone, announcing who controls memory, ceremony, and the right to define legitimacy. That is why the burned archives matter so much. A fire does not merely destroy paper, it removes the proof that would tie one house to another. In several courts, the timing of those losses is suspiciously convenient. Just when older claims grew complicated, the oldest ledgers seem to vanish first, and once the paper disappears, the story becomes easy to simplify. A dynasty can suddenly appear cleaner, older, or more local than it really was. The Tartarian thread becomes harder to dismiss when maps, symbols, and marriages point in the same direction. Separate records begin to behave like fragments of one system. That system also appears in military administration. Frontier zones that were once described as distant or undefined suddenly become organized under new imperial labels. When those labels change, the local population does not vanish overnight. Instead, the official description shifts faster than the people living inside the territory. That is why royal family trees are so important here. They are not just family records, they are maps of which identity was absorbed, renamed, or hidden. A missing ancestor is not always a biological mystery. Sometimes it is a political one, created so the public inherits a cleaner, safer version of the past. The same logic explains why some palace collections are so carefully preserved while the surrounding paperwork is not. Objects can survive even when their origin story is being edited. If you wanted to hide a common ancestry, you would protect the symbols and destroy the connective tissue. That is exactly what the archive gaps resemble. And that leaves the final question hanging over every crowned portrait. Were these royal houses descendants of separate nations or surviving branches of one erased imperial world? The more carefully you examine the records, the less random the silences look. They begin to form a strategy, one meant to survive scrutiny by staying incomplete. So the surviving evidence is not just a curiosity. It is a last invitation to ask who controlled the bloodline, who controlled the buildings, and who controlled the story. If the surviving evidence was left incomplete on purpose, then the next question is unavoidable. Who benefited from the silence, and who inherited the gap? Because once you trace the royal trees far enough back, the missing branches stop looking accidental. They begin to look edited, trimmed away at exactly the same depth. That is why the Tartarian question matters here. It is not about folklore alone. It is about whether an older political order was buried beneath newer crowns. Look at the marriages first. Dynasties did not only expand through conquest. They expanded through women whose origins were often made to appear harmless, distant, and untraceable. The same pattern keeps returning. Prestigious husbands, obscure brides, and paper trails that become thin precisely when the bloodline matters most. That thinning is not neutral. It suggests curation, a deliberate narrowing of what later historians would be allowed to see and repeat. When the lineage finally reaches the eastern courts, the silence becomes louder. Romanov records present continuity, but continuity is not the same thing as transparency. The official line speaks of noble inheritance and legitimate succession, yet the deeper you read, the more those transitions feel managed, not merely recorded. And then come the whispers. Tatar connections appear in notes, side comments, and scholarly footnotes that seem to retreat the moment they are named. That word matters because it brushes against a larger forbidden idea, that the dynasty map may have been drawn over something far older than the map itself. Now the buildings enter the case. Great palaces rise across Europe with the same measured authority, as if one design language moved through many capitals. This is where coincidence starts to fail. Similar facades are easy to excuse, but shared proportions, layouts, and structural logic point to something deeper. If the same technical mind can be seen in stone, then the architecture is not decoration. It is the signature of a power structure that outlived the paperwork, and the timing is suspicious. Many of these monumental sites rise or are rebuilt in the same century when Tartary disappears from the maps. If that date range is no accident, then palaces become markers of transition. They show where the old order was repackaged, not simply replaced. Then the symbols line up. Double-headed eagles appear across empires, not as isolated ornaments, but as recurring claims to a shared authority. A symbol is not just art, it is a code of belonging. It tells the viewer which house claims legitimacy, continuity, and ancient right. Language follows the same pattern. Courts often pretended to be separate, yet private correspondence suggests a shared diplomatic inner circle that outsiders never heard. And when a shared language is hidden behind official forms, it usually means the real identity is being reserved for insiders only. Then come the fires, and the fires are never just fires. They erase the exact records that would have settled succession, bloodline, and ownership. Across Madrid, Hanover, and other court centres, key archives vanish at the very moment old claims would have needed verification. Siberia then becomes the final clue. Early reports describe cities, roads, and organised populations where later textbooks prefer emptiness and distance. If those cities were real, then the historical silence around them is not ignorance, it is selection. Someone chose which past would survive, and that same choice may have protected the names behind the bloodline. That is why the bloodline, the buildings, and the maps must be read together. Each one survives with just enough damage to keep the whole story unfinished, as if the line itself was meant to be noticed only by those who know where to look. So the surviving evidence is not an ending. It is a warning that the hidden line may still be visible, if anyone is willing to ask who built the throne before it was renamed. And if the throne was renamed, what else in the family tree was rewritten with it?